So we're going to talk about socialism and communism today. I feel like the main argument I hear against socialism and communism is, oh, it never works. Oh, it sounds good, but it doesn't work. And honestly, I feel like people who argue against it make the mistake when they respond to that. They immediately start trying to prove socialism or communism worked somewhere. But I think that's the wrong conversation. I think the better question is, when was socialism or communism ever allowed to fail or succeed on its own? So now, riddle me this. Can you name a major socialist or communist movement the United States did not intervene in? Like, no sanctions, they didn't isolate them, they didn't destabilize them, they did not invade them, they didn't fund opposition against them, they didn't, support a coup or an embargo. No, probably not. Cuba, the embargo, invasion attempts, assassination attempts, covert operations. Chile, the 1973 coup. Nicaragua, the Contra War, and the CIA funding the crack epidemic. Yeah, it's a fun one. Vietnam, decades of war. Korea, the Korean War. Guatemala, the 1954 coup. Grenada, U.S. invasion. Laos, covert war. Cambodia, bombing campaigns. Angola, Cold War intervention. This is like just a few of them. Before we go any further, ask yourself this. Would capitalism survive the same treatment? Imagine every capitalist country under embargo, constant assassination attempts. We've got foreign-backed insurgencies, economic warfare, military threats. Let's be realistic. Would any economic system thrive under those conditions? I think the better angle is if socialism was guaranteed to fail on its own because it doesn't work, why would the United States be having to spend billions of dollars trying to stop it if it doesn't work? So now let's talk a little history. A big reason the United States justified so many of these interventions, is what we'll call them, is something called the domino theory. So this was popularized, I think, during the Eisenhower administration, but it was repeated by a lot of people throughout the Cold War. But it was a theory that argued that if one country became communist, neighboring countries would eventually follow, like a row of falling dominoes. And the idea became one of the primary justifications for U.S. involvement. The fear wasn't that just a single country would adopt socialism or communism. The fear was that it would eventually keep spreading and it would hit the United States. So whether you agree with that theory or not, it does kind of help explain why the United States was willing to spend enormous amounts of money, resources, political capital, trying to prevent socialist governments from taking power around the world. But the issue that I have with it is that it challenges this argument that socialism or communism doesn't work. Because if it doesn't work, then how is it spreading? Why are you so scared of it? Another reason why I feel like that argument doesn't really work too well is that people will pull up failures of socialism or communism as proof that socialism or communism doesn't work. But every failure under capitalism is not proof that capitalism doesn't work. It just means that the corruption is bad. It's the politicians' fault. Bad management, right? We've got high homelessness, people going bankrupt. There's child poverty, hunger, financial crashes, student debt. Historically, capitalism has produced the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis, massive inequality, repeated recessions, and colonial extraction across the world. And colonial extraction, to put it lightly, is when powerful countries build wealth by taking land, labor, minerals, oil, resources from colonized nations and leaving them poorer and less developed. The wealth flows outward and the consequences stay behind. So when people ask, when has socialism ever worked? When has communism ever worked? I think we should ask a different question. Why has the most powerful capitalist country on earth spent so much time making sure socialist and communist projects never get the chance to develop on their own? Let's answer that question. Before I get into why the United States absolutely is terrified of socialism and communism, I really urge you to look into some examples, and I would suggest you start with operations that shaped the Cold War. So look up Operation PB Success. It helped overthrow Guatemala's government after land reforms threatened the profits of the United Fruit Company. Another one that some of us should know already, the Bay of Pigs invasion, was an attempt to overthrow the Cuban government because Cuba was nationalizing industries and moving towards socialism. Another one is Operation Condor. That's a rough one. Pretty coordinated right-wing governments across South America were campaigning against leftists and political dissent. A big one that's relevant right now, the 1953 coup against Iran because they were trying to nationalize their oil industry. Even Operation Northwoods. Operation Northwoods, they proposed carrying out terrorist attacks on Miami, and they were going to lie and blame it on Cuba so that they could justify going to war with Cuba. They were going to kill innocent Americans in the name of preventing socialism and communism. And now when we ask ourselves, what does the United States have to lose to communism or socialism? Everything. Money, control, access. Like in Guatemala, it was the fruit company. In Iran, it was the oil. In Chile, it was the mining interests. In Cuba, it was the sugar and other American investments. When a country nationalizes industries, those industries are no longer controlled by private corporations or foreign investors. The profits that originally flowed into American companies and shareholders are redirected toward the country itself. So whether those governments succeeded or failed is a separate debate, but the threat to American business interests was very real. And that shifts the conversation kind of away from ideology. Like, it doesn't really matter whether you agree with socialism or communism. It kind of shifts towards economics. And something that's very important to note is that none of this just happened like in a vacuum. While interventions were happening abroad, Americans at home were being taught to view communism through a very specific lens. During the Cold War, Americans were raised in a culture of intense anti-communism messaging. School children were taught duck and cover drills in preparation for possible Soviet nuclear attacks. In fact, I actually just called my grandmother before filming this video. She was born in 1954, and I asked her about it. She remembers what she said they called them air raid drills. And she said she remembers them all through elementary and middle school. And she said that they would sometimes have the students get underneath their desks and cover their heads, and other times they would line them up against the lockers and have them cover their heads. The federal government actually even produced an educational film featuring a character called Bert the Turtle to teach children what to do in the event of a nuclear strike. So looking back, it's not really hard to question what these drills were actually accomplishing, right? Because if a nuclear weapon had truly detonated nearby, hiding under a desk or standing against a locker offers essentially no protection. To me, it seems like the drills did more than prepare people for an emergency. They helped create essentially this generation of people associating communism with fear, with nuclear annihilation, with essentially just this giant existential threat to their way of life. So when people say communism or socialism never works, it's worth asking how much of that belief comes from studying those systems directly and how much of it comes from decades of Cold War propaganda. So I'm going to close out my video with saying this because I'm definitely running out of time here. But if we're going to talk about socialism and communism in terms of success as a capitalist society, you should definitely define what success means to you, because most capitalists will define success as like corporate profits, GDP growth, stock market growth. Communists and socialists will more than likely define success as like universal housing, universal healthcare, literacy, food security, life expectancy, worker power. You're measuring success by capitalist standards. So of course, socialism or communism is going to sound like it's going to fail. So essentially what I'm saying is, instead of posing the question of whether or not socialism or communism works, you should examine who each system works for. Because when you have wealthy capitalists telling you that socialism and communism doesn't work, does it not work, or does it not work for them and their wealth? Of course, communism and socialism is a direct threat to wealthy people and corporations. But does that mean it doesn't work, or does it not work for them?